Okay, everyone, thank you for bearing with us. We're just trying to sync what's going on in the two tents, so they're just kicking off in there. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Heather Jones to the West Cork History Festival. She was supposed to come in her first year and she couldn't make it, so we finally got her to West Cork, which is absolutely brilliant. Heather is an expert on the First World War and the Irish Decade of Centenaries. She studied originally at Trinity College, Dublin, and she's now a professor of modern and contemporary European history at University College London. And I should just say, when we met to discuss this in a coffee shop near UCL, we were talking about Irish history, and this totally random guy came over and he went, I study history of Marxism, but my grandfather played played rugby for Ireland. What should be on my reading list? And I said, well, Heather can tell you. So he went away with a long list, and I'm hoping he's read all those books now. Yeah. It's just one of those things that happens. People overhear conversations. It was really nice. So Heather's written a number of books, but the one she's going to be talking about today is a book that she wrote a couple of years ago about King George V, and she's focusing specifically on his relationship with Ireland in her talk today. There will be the opportunity for questions afterwards. So enjoy the talk, and over to you, Heather.
So I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'd like to thank Victoria and Simon for the invitation and also for organising what is a fantastic festival. It's really wonderful to be, back among friends, to be in Ireland, back from London, and it's just really great to be here. So what I'm doing today is I'm talking about my 2021 book, which was on the topic of monarchism in society, really, on these islands during the period 1912 to 1923, and particularly the role of the monarchy in the First World War, but also obviously its role in Ireland. And I got interested in this because I wanted to, when I moved to the UK, I was really fascinated in where I live in England by this kind of presence of monarchism. It's just people just accepted it as normal, postcards of royal statues, everything was just part of the zeitgeist. And with the recent coronation, it was obviously very evident, particularly in the things my children were bringing home from school, pictures of King Charles that they'd all been asked to draw, for example, in class, just random things, very strange phenomenon. And as someone who wasn't from there, I got really interested in this as a phenomenon with the history and thinking about how monarchism changes over time. It's not the same thing as a historic phenomenon in the past. And in World War I, it's something different to what it is today. It evolves, it changes. And I think of it as an ism that needs to be historicized, a bit like the other ones we look at, like nationalism, socialism. And I began to think, obviously, about republicanism. And start to see this question of the Irish decade of war and revolution as in part, a clash between republicanism and monarchism as cultures and belief systems, if you like, that people held very dearly in this period. And I particularly noticed, in contrast to the island of Ireland, the lack of a kind of anti-monarchism in wartime, World War I Britain. There were some jokes about the King and Queen, and they were nicknamed fertile and futile, for example. There were some moments. The palace courtiers got very alarmed about some graffiti in a second-class train carriage that was criticising George V. But this is nothing compared to what was going on in Ireland at the time. Statues being pulled down, wounded soldiers meeting the King being booed on cinema reels. I mean, it really takes off in Ireland in a completely different way. And the idea of republicanism becomes a really kind of central principle of the struggle for Irish independence. And so I started to look at this and think about how did this happen. And what I want to talk about today, this morning, is the role of George V in all of this as an individual. George V in the recent Netflix documentary, The Crown, he's briefly referred to as a stamp collector. What was George V doing during the First World War? The character of Prince Philip says to the Queen, he was collecting stamps while all this was going on. This is completely inaccurate. Yes, he collected stamps, but that was kind of his escapism, what we'd almost call kind of his mental health preservation therapy. He did it for an hour or so a day. It was a way to kind of switch off from the horrors of war that he was seeing when he visited hospitals and the stresses of things like what was going on in Ireland afterwards. So he was doing a lot more, and I would argue he's actually one of the most political British monarchs of the past 200 years. A lot of this is behind the scenes, and that's what I want to talk about today. Now, he had a very strong personal interest in Ireland. And I don't want to imply today that I've covered everything. There are a lot of gaps in the archive record about George V. There are things we still don't know, things we still can't access. But what I want to suggest today is that there is a trajectory we can see. It moves from reform, when George V first comes to the throne in 1910. He's faced immediately with the Home Rule crisis, the removal of the House of Lords veto the following year, followed by the third Home Rule Bill, which is clearly going to pass. And that Home Rule crisis, the monarchy immediately has to deal with that at the start of his reign. And initially they turned to reform. I then want to suggest he's faced with revolutions, not just one, but two. And the first revolution starts in Ulster. It's a revolution in unionism. Unionism moves to the north. It stops being an all-Ireland body to a great degree. The power moves to the Ulster Unionist leadership, and it largely moves towards jettisoning the Southern Unionist power players across the decade. And it becomes much more radical. In 1912, it becomes a mass political phenomenon using a lot of propaganda methods that we'd later see in the First World War. And so that's the first challenge of revolution he has to face. And the second is obviously Irish republicanism and the rise of republicanism. And then I want to finish with George V's royal regret. I was quite worried when I realised the title that actually people might think this was a kind of a reference to kind of some other kind of royal regret. But no, this is very much George V's royal regret that I'm talking about here today. And what I want to really show is how they try to navigate through these very difficult, challenging situations. One has to think always the monarchy is always acting from the monarchy's perspective, not the government of the day, the monarchy. They are acting out of monarchical interest throughout this. So to deal first, this is the kind of the trajectory of the talk. To deal first with this question of the question of reform. So one of the key things George V did when he came to the throne was a kind of hearts and minds campaign in Ireland towards Ireland. He reformed on his accession immediately the monarchy's anti-Catholicism. So on Catholicism, he was quite open-minded compared to his peers. A lot of the British establishment still had some of that, some vestiges of anti-Catholicism. He got the Protestant Declaration that he was supposed to make, which was profoundly anti-Catholic, dropped from his first parliamentary speech, and also the anti-Catholic clause annulled from his coronation oath. He now he changed it to a declaration simply that he was a Protestant and would uphold the Protestant succession. So there had been a much more anti-Catholic element to that. He drops that, and in 1911, he and Queen Mary visit Ireland, and they visit many places in Ireland. They visit the seminary at Maynooth. This was seen as a huge sort of reaching out, hearts and minds kind of action. And at Dublin City Hall, he is met by the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin. And this is all seen as quite radical reform at the time. The Home Rule Party is slightly unsettled by this. They have voted against the civil list. They have quite a strong anti-monarchist element, although some figures like Redmond were much more prepared to compromise on monarchy. But a lot of the Home Rule Party has Republican views, but has accepted Home Rule as a sort of stepping stone. And they're really unsettled by this reaching out and this 1911 visit. And the Viceroy, who's Viceroy at the time, Lord Aberdeen, is also working very hard to improve the monarchy's image in Ireland, make it appear receptive to Catholic grievances by 1912. Now, the Home Rule Party is also in a situation where Home Rule seems to be imminent. The Third Home Rule Bill is going to pass. And so they are faced with also this question, what are they going to do about the monarchy in this situation with a rise of pressure from Ulster for some kind of partitionist settlement. And so some of the Home Rule Party are arguing that there should be some kind of compromise, and others are arguing for none. And at the same time, anti-monarchism is really deep-seated in parts of the Irish nationalist movement. And that's particularly the case, obviously, for anyone associated with the IRB. The clue is in the name, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And there in 1867, their declaration on the eve of their failed uprising refers to the curse of monarchical government. So it's very deep-seated folk cultural opposition as well, in ballads and in a whole load of other areas, going right back to the 1798 rebellion of opposition to the monarchy in Ireland. And to some extent, this opposition is almost unique in the British Empire of the time. It's very, it's very long-term, deep-seated, and quite well developed. So all this is going on, and this is coinciding with this Hearts and Minds campaign. And I've just an image here of Queen Mary meeting nuns at Maynooth. Now, the second element that George V tries to do in this period is he tries to arbitrate on Home Rule, to try and smooth the tension that's developing around this problem of what to do about Ulster unionism. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But by the summer of 1914, there was a real risk of an Irish civil war. There are two militias organised in Ireland by this point, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Irish Volunteer Force. It looks like there's going to be civil war. Many people in London think there will be. There's an awful lot of concern about that. And so the Buckingham Palace Conference happens as an event where the King personally invites the leaders of the Unionist Party, their backers in London, the leading Tory diehards on the Act of Union, who don't want any concession, any Home Rule, and the leaders of the Irish Parliamentary Party to his home, to Buckingham Palace. And it's framed like that, a personal invitation from the monarch. Very difficult to say no to that in the culture of 1914. And so this is an attempt to try and, if you like, bring them together in a room, get them to talk, and avoid a potential civil war. There's a lot of debate over whose idea this was. Some people, some figures say Fritz Ponsonby, for example, in his memoirs said it was his idea. There's some evidence it might have actually been the King's, and also potentially Asquith. So a bit of debate as to where the idea came from. But some Liberal MPs are appalled because they see this as the monarch overreaching his constitutional role. He should not be involved in policies of the government of the day. And here he is bringing these figures to Buckingham Palace. Now, the King in his defence said, well, I didn't stay in the room. I brought them in, I welcomed them, and then I exited. But either way, it is quite a radical move, quite a political move to actually do that. And it's pinned to a high degree on the King's own reputation. He's a new monarch. He hasn't really established that yet. He's quite a gruff figure. He doesn't have the popularity yet of his father, Edward VII. So it's a risk. And then the conference fails. And they don't actually come out with a solution. So it was a very risky moment, again, for the monarchy with regard to Ireland. And it's the first time the King actually meets Redmond personally. And he likes Redmond. And they get on. He finds Carson much more difficult to deal with. And of course, all this has to be kept under wraps. But there starts to be a sense in Irish nationalism that actually this monarch is a little bit favourable towards Home Rule and has certainly accepted that there can be changes to the Act of Union. He is not wedded to the Act of Union by this point. And figures such as Kevin O'Shiel note, there's a quote I want to read you. They note that the Buckingham Palace Conference can be said to have represented the last straw of hope for a tolerable settlement of the Irish question along strictly limited and constitutional lines. It seemed to Irish nationalists that seeing that the King had directly and actively intervened, an All-Ireland Parliament would, with proper safeguards to allay Ulster apprehensions, at last result. Hence it was that nationalists were frankly surprised and disappointed at the conference's failure. They were sure that once the King had taken a hand in it, success must follow. Now, Kevin O'Shiel is someone who's interviewed for the Bureau of Military History witness statements that you've just heard about in the previous talk. And he is a radical nationalist. And that's his view, that actually, at that point, there were a lot of hopes on the nationalist side pinned on the Buckingham Palace conference. Now, the King's reputation avoids damage because just as the conference is failing, World War I and the July crisis occurs, leading to World War I. And of course, that sweeps away any question about what had happened at the Buckingham Palace Conference, what had gone wrong, why it hadn't worked, perhaps why the royal prestige hadn't worked its magic on these political leaders to find a solution for Ireland. And the war effort gives the monarchy this huge boost. The King is front and foremost the symbol of the nation in wartime. He is upheld as a symbol of Britishness. He is extremely hardworking in the service of the war effort, visits lots of hospitals constantly, sometimes 3-4 a day, actually goes to the Western Front. During the Spring Offensive of 1918, he's present in some of the casualty clearing stations. He rushes to the front to be with his men as he sees it. So it's a huge boost for the monarchy's popularity, his personal popularity too, as someone at the beginning of his reign. And that gives him the political brownie points, if you like, or the political value to then sell solutions to the Irish problem back home in Britain. So he suddenly becomes a really important figure who has the popularity in Britain to sell solutions that perhaps otherwise there might be opposition to. Now this brings me to my second theme, which is revolution. And here we see examples of the anti-Home Rule campaign from Ulster. And this is what's happening at this point is Ulster Unionism starts to mobilise a bit like a nationalism, actually. It really starts to use forms of modern propaganda. It uses forms of mass politics. It tries to rally around an idea of Britishness and against Home Rule. And it emphasises in this the crown, the crown, the crown. However, what's really key here is, of course, that devolution didn't threaten the monarchy. the crown was not under threat at all in this. So a lot of this is a sleight of hand in some of this propaganda. There was no threat with Home Rule, a devolved parliament in Dublin, to the monarchy status in Ireland. That was not in question in Home Rule. But this is what's being used in some of this mass politics. And this is quite difficult for the monarchy to deal with. Again, one of the issues for George V is he's not seen as unionist enough, perhaps because, as I said, he actually is, has a certain softness for Home Rule. And you'll notice in a lot of this propaganda from this period where unionism is mobilising, George V's personal image doesn't appear. It's over everything during World War I. Pictures of him personally and the Queen personally and their little faces on flags and all this type of thing. This is all very generic. It'll be an image of a crown. They will avoid that. And one of the reasons is they were deeply suspicious that the king himself was actually not supporting the Ulster Unionist position. Nora Roberts, an Anglo-Irish grandee, for example, living in County Cork around these parts, recalled that many agreed with the Ulsterman who complained, the king is no good, he's not loyal, which obviously put George V in quite a difficult position. He didn't meet the high standards of loyalism that were being demanded by this process. And so loyalty to a crown was being presented as part of this unionist mobilisation, but not necessarily loyalty to George V. The king also is furious about the Curragh Mutiny, because the mutineers in the Curragh Mutiny had claimed they were acting on his behalf. And actually they'd taken obviously an oath, as anyone who entered the British Army had taken, to serve him. And here they were mutinying. And this was seen as incredibly disrespectful. And he also found it deeply upsetting that they had claimed to be acting on his behalf when he had not sanctioned this. So the position regarding unionism is quite difficult for the monarchy. And when we get to this, the 1912 Solemn League and Covenant, just to move back a little bit from the Curragh Mutiny, the Solemn League and Covenant, obviously the term covenant, this goes back to the English Civil War, the Scottish Covenant, which was actually aimed against the monarchy. So this is very, very problematic, again, for the monarchy. And it refers to using all means which may be found necessary to defeat Home Rule. So that includes actually rebelling against the king should he sign assent to this legislation. So there ends up being this huge tension around the Home Rule Bill and this question of royal assent to the bill. And again, all this gets swept away once World War I breaks at the start of World War I. But in September 1914, when royal assent has to be given to the bill, which is now passed Parliament, the king receives lots of petitions and letters from unionists saying, don't sign it, don't sign it. Now, that would have been completely unconstitutional. And to his credit, George V does go ahead and give royal assent to the bill. And when this happens, a Labour MP, Will Crooks, starts to sing God Save the King in Parliament, which again, you can see this realignment because they're so relieved that actually the King has supported the constitutional system and has stood with Parliament and has not given in to the pressure that's coming into him from particularly from Ulster. Now the unionist community in this period, these months before the First World War, when Home Rule is really looming, they have booed images of George V in cinemas. Some members of congregations in Protestant churches in some of the north have walked out when God Save the King was sung or played. So there's been quite a strong sense of not liking this particular king developing. However, obviously Ulster has been excluded through suspensory. The bill has been suspended and. It promises later amending legislation for Ulster. So it's not a total disaster in terms of the unionist perspective, but they're very dubious about the role of the monarchy in all of this. The war, however, again comes in to change that. So once you have mass mobilisation to serve in the British Army, to go and serve in what are termed as the King's armies in World War I, you have what's seen as a kind of unionist sacrifice on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, etc. This again brings around a new view and again a kind of a reconciliation, if you like, between unionism and the monarchy. However, within that, there are still tensions. There are resentments that George V during the war never visits the Belfast shipyards. He doesn't go. That's one of the reasons given later on for inviting him to open the new Northern Irish Parliament. He doesn't visit those shipyards. He visits all the other ones around all of the island of Britain, and that's seen as again an indication of this ongoing sensitivity around that relationship. I just want to show this image of how this starts to change during the war, because this is from a Southern Unionist source. This is the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin, John Bernard, talking about the importance of monarchy in the Southern Unionist mindset at this period. And obviously we're a month into we're just over a month into World War I here. And he says, for us, the words "God save the King" mean so much more. They express, first of all, a sentiment of personal devotion to the sovereign, which has been growing and deepening during the last 100 years. Nice sleight of hand there over all the issues that have been going on in the previous months. And they are charged with emotion as we remember that the king is a symbol and bond of national unity. And he talks then about this idea of the king as kind of uniting the empire and the nation, different religions, and everybody standing in the same relation to the king as the visible bond, uniting these diverse forces and aspirations. And so the prayer, God save the king, is a solemn prayer for the maintenance of our free national life. And that gets to the crux of what I was saying earlier about monarchism as a belief system. This is actually a belief. This guy, I mean, you know, he's an archbishop. He's saying this in a sermon. This is a sacralization of monarchy. God Save the King is not just an anthem, but also a prayer. And the two functions of that national anthem are overlapping when it is sung in religious services in this period. And so that is kind of what's going on here with this wartime monarchism in unionism that is now getting consolidated. And for nationalists, this is a difficult moment in terms of figures like Kathleen Barry Maloney. She's the sister of Kevin Barry. She talks about the outbreak of the First World War as a moment where a lot of people actually rally towards defending the United Kingdom against Germany. And she talks about how she finds this very disturbing. Lots of people she knew who she didn't expect start volunteering for the British Army. And in the cinema, she found it impossible to stand for God Save the King during a performance. So the war is really changing some of these dynamics. And this brings me then to the second revolution that the monarchy had to face in Ireland, which was obviously the Republican Revolution, which I think really breaks out massively with the Easter Rising of 1916 and then reveals its popular dominance with the 1918 general election when we see mass support for a republic in that vote. So by that point, Home Rule has really been swept aside in Ireland. But the British monarchy isn't because it's the war and all the other things that are going on, it isn't very well informed about that sea change, that actual the extent and the depth of that sea change. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. And one of the reasons it gets confused is there are still phenomena going on where members of the Irish public are still looking to the monarchy to intervene as the War of Independence develops. So when Terence MacSwiney is on his hunger strike, a lot of Irish nationalist figures who are not Republicans, who are kind of former Home Rulers, perhaps, or still maybe Home Rule on the fence position, moving towards republicanism, they actually send petitions to the king to intervene, to get Terence MacSwiney released, to prevent him dying from hunger strike. And the king actually, behind the scenes, unsuccessfully does try to get him moved from prison to house arrest. So again, there's this sense of, for the monarchy, people are still appealing to it, even though there's been this landslide for the idea of a republic in the December 1918 election. And Kevin Barry's family take a very different attitude to this idea of petitioning the king. And this is a particularly powerful quote, because this shows the extent to which republicanism is now, on the other side, has become embedded as a deeply held belief system. And so Kevin Barry's sister talks about how on the eve of her brother's execution, remember, he's only a teenager, a mutual friend of ours and of the family of Sir James McMahon, who was the Undersecretary for Ireland, came to the family and they asked her mother to send a telegram to the king, to appeal to the king to intervene against the execution of her son. And that this telegram will be sent by special arrangement quickly to the British king. And she says, "Mother refused on the ground that any recognition by her of the British king would compromise her full support of the Republican Army." Now, she's not even prepared to send a telegram because that is too much of a compromise of her faith in republicanism. That's pretty deeply held as a value. She was not prepared to go there. And so, this really, I think, indicates just how deeply held this has become, and this isn't really realised on the side of the British monarchy. The material culture of monarchism in the War of Independence is a big part of this story as to why this anti-monarchism surges. If we think of terms like the king's uniform, the king's shilling, they're all around before the war, but they take on a new force during the War of Independence. And if you look at charge sheets against people who are arrested for being members of the IRA, and the charge sheet for Patrick Higgins of Ardra was that he did levy war against His Majesty the King by attacking a detachment of His Majesty's troops. So there's a lot of monarchist language in this, which would obviously lead Republicans to think this is a, there's a battle against the crown, and that's where we get the language about the crown forces as well, which is not something you find so much in some of the other contexts in this period. It occurs a lot in the Irish War of Independence. And if we look at Kathleen Clarke's memoirs, the widow of Tom Clarke, she talks about how when her home was raided during the War of Independence, the raiders stated they were military and she must open the door in the name of His Majesty the King. We want to search your house. So again, you have to open the door of your house in the name of the King. I mean, this is all quite extreme. And this explains the attacks on things like post boxes and Republicans refusing to use stamps with the King's head on them, all this, pulling down statues, all this, because it becomes a war of symbols. Republicanism versus monarchism. Isms are actually operating very strongly in this whole situation. And Kathleen Clarke, when she becomes Lord Mayor of Dublin, one of her first acts is to take down the royal portraits from the Mansion House. So you can see this goes on for a long time. This is decades after. So what does the monarchy do? Well, King George V is very interesting during the War of Independence because constitutionally he can't speak out. He can't say anything. He is bounded and must not criticise his government's policies. However, behind the scenes, for example, when partition starts to be discussed and the Government of Ireland Act is coming in 1920, he asks for assurances behind the scenes from Ulster Unionists that the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland will not be mistreated. He wants guarantees, he wants promises on that. He really strongly disapproves of his Prime Minister David Lloyd George's policy of reprisals. We know this because a Dublin Castle civil servant, Mark Sturgis, in his diary, reports that the Chief Secretary of Ireland, Sir Hammer Greenwood, and his wife had lunched with the King in May 1921, and the latter was mightily displeased with the lot of us and all our works, pitched into the government all through lunch and said he hated the idea of the Black and Tans. And there's also a very famous newspaper leak where an American journalist reported that the King opposed Lloyd George's policies of oppression in Ireland. And it even said, I cannot have my people killed like this. Now, of course, the palace then sort of steps back and says, no, there was no such interview, we never talked to the King. But then in the actual files, the private secretary says, well, yeah, I actually did meet the journalist. And I did talk to him. This is Lord Stamfordham, who's basically the King's eyes and ears and never, ever makes a mistake. So Stamfordham sort of takes the fall for this and says, oh, well, I may have said something, but of course it wasn't actually what the King said. But the reality is actually this leak may have been deliberate to try and discredit Lloyd George and an attempt to embarrass the government. So there's a lot going on there. Stamfordham never, in all of the stuff I've looked at with Stamfordham, he is an extremely astute operator. And I have started to suspect that journalist report that went out to the States was actually a deliberate attempt to distance the monarchy a little bit from what Lloyd George was doing. Now that brings me on to the opening of the new Northern Ireland Parliament. And there's a number of reasons why the monarch was wanted for this role. Craig wanted the new Northern Ireland Parliament to look like an imperial parliament. The Imperial Conference was happening in London at the same time. He wanted the world leaders there of South Africa, of Australia, of New Zealand. And they didn't want to be associated with partition or the new Northern Ireland at all. So they didn't want to go. And Craig wanted the monarch to open this parliament as if it was a bona fide new parliament rather than a devolved parliament within the United Kingdom. And the courtiers are really worried about this. They don't want the king being seen as doing what they see as a minor role. Yes, he'll open imperial parliaments. He's done, that's kind of that would normally fall under his kind of remit or his representative's remit. But to open a devolved parliament is a different thing. And so there's questions about status. There's questions about what he's going to say. And Craig really hopes the king is going to come and actually do it like an opening of state parliament in Westminster. He'll come and read out Craig's government's plans for the new Northern Ireland government for the coming period. And the courtiers are aghast at that. And the king himself is also apparently deeply distressed by the first draft of Craig's speech that he wants them to read. Now, the other reason why the king would be going is Sir Edward Grigg, Lloyd George's advisor, private secretary. He thinks, and he writes this in June 1921, that Ireland is very sentimental. And like India, monarchist to the core. He's getting so much wrong there on both countries. But this is what he thought. And so he feels that if the king shows up, there's still enough support for the monarch in Ireland for him to be able to say something of value and bring some kind of breakthrough in the conflict. The king himself, it's ultimately his personal decision to go. it's very risky. Many British establishment figures warn him not to go, and they ask for the visit to be called off. Stamford says he's actually receiving letters, and there is a very strong difference of opinion about the king going to Belfast, and many Irishmen, including those residing in that country, tell me that His Majesty is running considerable risk in going. Queen Mary chooses to go at the last minute. She's invited, but she also chooses to go because she thinks the king's less likely to be assassinated if she's with him, which is, again, given Sarajevo, is a bit of a dubious hope. But and afterwards, she actually says to her lady-in-waiting, they could have got any of us on the trip. And what's also very interesting is the monarch knows he's going to be in danger, and there were plots to attack the Belfast GPO, but the place was swarming with security, so that was not going to happen. And then obviously there's the famous attack on the transport of troops who'd been attending the royal visit as it came south after the royal visit in Armagh, in which some of the horses and four people were killed. So there was a real serious danger to his safety. And if one looks at the visit, how it's set up, there's a real debate about how long he's actually in the city. So the Freeman's Journal reports he's only there 4.5 hours. The organiser, Neville Wilkinson, claims he's there for 7, but clearly they're getting him in and they're getting him out as fast as they can. It's not an unremitted success for Northern Unionism. And what I want to mention just here on this speech is Craig's draft doesn't go ahead. The king brings in Jan Smuts to lunch and asks Jan Smuts to write a draft of the speech instead of the one that Craig had sent over to London. And Jan Smuts obliges and writes a speech that is, the whole draft is about giving Ireland Dominion status. Now, when that draft goes to Lloyd George, with the king's approval, Lloyd George is horrified because he's not at the Dominion status point now. He still wants his Northern Parliament, his Southern Home Rule Parliament, and this is quite a political intervention. So he goes to Cabinet, and Cabinet actually asks Arthur Balfour to draft a new draft to get rid of Smuts's very radical Dominion status draft. And they send that to the palace, and the king says no. He rejects Balfour's draft. Again, this is really pushing to the limit of the constitution what the king can do. He's supposed to do speeches that are approved and written for him by the government. And so eventually Lloyd George then gets his advisor, Edward Grigg, to hammer together kind of version of Smuts's speech and of Balfour's speech, and they kind of put it together, send it back to the palace, and then the king actually changes that and adds in his own personal discussions, his own personal hopes for Ireland. And the actual speech that's given is all about, it doesn't really mention unions, it praises their role in the war, but it's all about the idea later on of two Irish parliaments reunifying. And it also trails Dominion status. So the monarchy's end game here is an all-Ireland Dominion within the empire. And this is one of the reasons they're turning to Smuts. Smuts had been a South African Boer rebel against the British. Now they've got a South African Dominion solution of South Africa within the empire, and Smuts is now the new best friend of the British establishment and the king. And they're hoping for something like that for Ireland. And so this speech is really quite radical. Interestingly, when we read Unionist accounts, they're delighted the king has come, but they are a little bit uncomfortable about the actual speech. They're also very worried about alcohol. Alcohol sales are banned in Belfast because there's been a lot of sectarian violence, and they're really worried that if unionist crowds get lots of alcohol, this will actually result in riots, which is also very interesting in terms of their control of their own kind of heartland. And also they're concerned about who's going to give the bouquet to the Queen, which is quite an interesting aside. There's lots of rivalry over whether it be the Lord Mayor's children or Sir James Craig's daughter. So Ireland for the monarchy and for the British, by this point an imperial experiment, they're looking at it in terms of how could they make it into a dominion? And ideally a dominion under one parliament. That's what the King's speech talks about, under one parliament or two, but they're not thinking of a long-term, certainly from the monarchy's point of view, they're not thinking of this as being some kind of long-term partition. And in fact, one of the things the speech is meant to do is push Lloyd George towards Dominion status. When the King gets back to London, he's totally undermined the Tory diehards, one of whom has given a very aggressive speech on Ireland while he's been in Ireland, and he comes back. The royal kind of trip back from the station to the palace is greeted by lots of crowds in London, flag waving. He's seen as having taken a really brave stance, going somewhere dangerous, making a difficult speech, and of course this totally undermined the kind of grumpy Tory speech about Ireland that had been made in London while he was away. And he sends a message immediately to Lloyd George saying, "Do not lose this opportunity. Do not miss this opportunity." And it's a very pointed remark. Get on with it. And within days, they issue peace feelers in Ireland, and they issue a message asking for truce discussions. Now, they have been doing peace feelers before, but those had sort of been on the wane since May. So it's really the King who's there's quite big personal input in pushing this forward at this point. and particularly in undermining, as I said, those Tory diehards, some of whom are in the cabinet. It's a coalition cabinet, Liberals and Tories. So Tories, traditionally very monarchist, when the king does something, very hard to then come back and oppose him on that. So again, the King's Speech seen very positively by Irish nationalists. Ernest Blythe, in a very interesting comment in his interview for the Bureau of Military History, says how he had heard that the British cabinet had prepared a war to the hilt speech, but the king had refused to give it. So this is getting out to the nationalist side. And this again creates a kind of, they don't like the monarchy, they don't like the crown, but De Valera said, I don't mind the king, it's just the monarchy and the crown I can't deal with. I'm paraphrasing there slightly, but he didn't mind the king as a person, as an individual. So there was a certain degree of kind of recognising that he could push things and sell solutions to a British audience that the Irish radicals couldn't sell on their own. So the imperial reform here is quite important because in this period, everyone who's a subject of the king across the whole empire was a British subject. That was your nationality. There was no Canadian nationality, no Australian, no separate nationality. That was something the Irish Republican movement wanted. They wanted the right to issue their own passports, have their own nationality. But with the solution that was being offered under the Anglo-Irish Agreement, they were not necessarily going to get that. They later passed it anyway. But this was a transnational Britishness, a kind of international Britishness that spanned the globe, and the monarchy wanted to preserve that. So for Ireland, it wasn't so interested in the Act of Union. What it was interested in was that Irish people would remain British subjects. And after that, it didn't care whether it was a dominion or whether it was a protectorate or how the status worked. It was pushing, by this point, really for dominion status, but it was looking more for an idea of Canada as a solution, or Australia. And the king in his speech in Belfast refers to all those new dominions very pointedly in that speech, saying, I've seen these new nations come to fruition in my lifetime, and again, hinting very strongly at dominion status. And so Ireland is this experiment, and people get quite excited about this. They think that Ireland could be a new kind of dominion. This could be the answer to India. This could be the answer to problems in Egypt. Maybe this is the way forward. And this is all why the Oath of Allegiance is so important. This is Arthur Griffith's response to the Oath of Allegiance. So I'm getting slightly ahead of myself in the slides. But the Oath of Allegiance, the Irish side never grasped what that means to the British side. The Oath of Allegiance is something that's taken by all parliamentarians across the empire. The Oath of Allegiance to the head of state as the King Emperor is what keeps the whole thing intact. So the reformists in London and the monarchy at this point are starting to see that Whitehall can't politically govern all these places. So that can be dropped away. They can have their own parliaments, govern themselves, but what they want to retain is the link to the monarchy. So that would keep the nationality status intact and the empire intact. Everyone would still be a British subject, but they would have their own parliaments under this system. The link to Whitehall and Westminster would drop away. The link would be predominantly to the monarchy alone, and that was enough because that actually kept that was as the in the treaty talks, as Lloyd George said, the king is the arch that holds the whole of the empire together. And Lloyd George says this to De Valera as well in their talks. He says we cannot consent to any abandonment, however informal, of the principle of allegiance to the king. Now, the British side's a bit obsessed with this. They try to find wordings that will suit the Irish side. They look at the American oaths that people take to the American Constitution. They think they might fudge it as an oath to the Free State Constitution. But in the long run, they really need to have, for it to be dominion status for Ireland, there has to be an oath of allegiance. And on the Irish side, they've been fighting what they saw as an anti-monarchist campaign for a republic. They've taken an oath to the Republic. Those who've entered Dáil Éireann have taken an oath to it. They feel, some of them actually make this point, they're going to perjure themselves if they have to take another oath to a monarchy after that. So it's a really deeply held value. And Arthur Griffith points this out in this quote. He says, he tries to argue, look, it's not the same as the other dominions. And in the point he says, we're so close to Great Britain. It's not going to be the same. There will be interventions in the name of the crown in the future if we don't get rid of it now. And this is why we have to be different to other dominions and treated differently to other dominions, which aren't menaced, he uses the word menace, in the same way. For Gavin Duffy, who's in the Irish delegation, he makes another point showing the radicalism of this whole epoch. He says, we cannot agree to use the word allegiance. It is out of date. Loyalty is now due not to governments, but to nations. So you can see the changing attitudes here at the time. The British side is very different. The British argue, as I said, this is a symbol of common citizenship. And they say, no man can be a subject of two states. He must either be a subject of the king or an alien. And the question no more admits of an equivocal answer than whether he's alive or dead. So it's pretty straightforward. They're not going to give way on that. And ultimately, we know it's actually the British wording that makes into the treaty and that then leads to the Irish Civil War. It's a huge factor in the treaty debates in the Dáil, and it's also a huge factor for anti-treaty fighters. It's used in a lot of the propaganda, and again, it's used if we look at Ernest O'Malley. He talks about the men outside the forecourts have broken their oath to the Republic. So it's really deeply held. This issue of the oath is central to why we get an Irish Civil War. Now, I don't want to imply that on the British side all's hunky-dory once the Anglo-Irish Treaty is agreed. It has to be passed by Parliament. It has to be passed in two different votes, one on the treaty itself and one later on, a year later, on the new Free State Constitution, which nobody remembers because by that point the Civil War's broken out and they're just desperate to get the thing passed. But the way they passed the Anglo-Irish Treaty is, again, really, really monarchist. King George V himself arrives at the Houses of Parliament for the debate on the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And it's not done by a straight vote on ratification. What Parliament is asked to vote on, and this is quite a clever sleight of hand by Lloyd George, is a humble address to the King, congratulating him on the treaty and approving the treaty. And the King, before this humble address, speaks in Parliament of his heartfelt joy on learning of the agreement and his earnest hope that the treaty would end the strife of centuries. Now, that puts particularly Tory diehards in a really difficult position. Are you going to vote against the King's efforts for peace in Ireland? How can you get a humble address text reworded? This is much more difficult than just amending a bill. It's a parliamentary juggernaut. So they don't just have a straight vote on ratification. And this means that there really was no question, but that this was going to pass. The King, so popular at the end of the First World War, really putting all his political weight and popularity on top of that. And this shows just the kind of Civil War propaganda in Ireland. And again, this crown image that continues on. This is the kind of freedom the treaty gives you. The black and tans wore it in their caps. Someone who's a national soldier is fighting to establish an English king and an English constitution in Ireland. I mean, these are pretty hard-hitting things. So this brings me now to my summing up and royal regret. Where do we get to on this? Does the British monarchy show signs of regretting the outcome in Ireland? And the answer is yes, it does. It had been hoping for an all-island dominion, effectively, eventually reunited, one parliament, and something akin to South Africa, where the strife of the Boer rebellion is then calms down, settled within the empire. The king in 1922 offers to open the new Dáil on the establishment of the Irish Free State, thinking he can go down and do the same thing he'd done in Belfast, and that's rejected. What the monarchy hasn't realised, those who have accepted the treaty in Ireland, many of them are also devout Republicans. And the monarchy thinks that actually it's going to be a dominion, and they are really supporting and believing in dominion status, but of course they're not. And his offer is brusquely rejected was the term used when he offers to do that. And so really ultimately this hope that they had doesn't work, and so they're really left with a sense of it having failed. And what we find is there's a wonderful statement that George V says to Ramsay MacDonald in 1930 that the British had been fools not to have accepted Gladstone's Home Rule Bill. And that suggests that actually he really recognised that unionism had led them down a path that actually, they should have accepted Home Rule, got that through, and that would have avoided some of the later fallout. So to actually say that, to actually kind of disown the unionist project at that point of retaining the active union, saying they'd be fools not to have accepted Gladstone's Home Rule Bill, is quite a powerful mark of regret at the end. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, the British monarchy never understood the speed and extent to which republicanism had spread throughout Ireland. They were operating on time lag. I'd say of about a year, it was what it looks like in the documents. They're about a year behind in trying to keep up with what is going on, despite having lots of people informing them. The people informing them are usually pro-monarchy, and that can be an issue. They're not hearing enough about the Republican points. Unionism in Ulster has radicalised, and that's very difficult for the monarchy as well. They have to try and deal with that. It's not necessarily to their advantage. King George V is very popular, and it's actually his popularity that helps sell the Anglo-Irish Treaty in Britain and to stop any major pushback on that. And it helps explain the speech to open the Northern Irish Parliament. It helps explain how some of these events unfolded because he's acting behind the scenes. But ultimately, the monarchy's 1922 long-term goal, which was an all-island dominion within the empire, failed. It failed then, and it doesn't transpire later on either, because obviously empire then collapses after the Second World War as well. So ultimately, despite those interventions, they don't get to the place they were ultimately trying to navigate to. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather. That was absolutely fantastic. I loved your anecdote about squabbling over who's going to present the bouquet. I mean, talk about fiddling while Rome burns.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got time for about 10 minutes worth of questions. So if you want to pick your...
Yeah, this one back there.
Yeah, I'm interested in that sort of last point you were making about George's naive assumption that there would be an Indian state. I mean, where was, was he getting, did he meet with Redmond regularly after 1911? Where was he getting his information from?
So his information is coming a lot from Southern Unionists, actually, and also from Tory peers who have estates in Ireland. Right. And these are not the most reliable informers. However, through Smuts, he's getting information almost from the horse's mouth, because Smuts is actually in contact with De Valera, and they're operating through intermediaries. So by the end of the War of Independence, they're playing catch up, and he is getting quite good information on what De Valera will accept or not accept. And Smuts is trying to talk De Valera out of the Republic. Smuts is saying, look, you won't get the Republic, but you get everything else. You know, can we kind of work through this way? I wanted a Republic for South Africa, didn't get it, and it's all okay now. So there is some link with Republicans by that point, but earlier on, his main information is coming from people who aren't actually themselves that well informed about the changes that are happening around them. It's very rapid, remember, 1916 to 1918, this is quite a quick period for Home Rule to be swept away, and it really is swept away, and obviously Redmond dies as well, so in that point. So it's a very sudden U-turn, and I think they're dealing with a lot of global issues, particularly with the fallout from World War I. Will the Treaty of Versailles work, etc. They do definitely not see the extent to which republicanism is actually a faith, a belief system for many of those in Ireland by the end of this. Yeah.
A lot of what are called Republicans on the Irish side, are they not really extreme nationalists? Much as Sinn Féin is today. Sinn Féin call themselves Republicans, but there isn't much evidence of them. You know, they all worshipped the church and did all that kind of stuff. So, but they're not just extreme nationalists rather than Republicans.
So there's a debate about when they become Republicans and how Republican do they become. And I couldn't get that in for reasons of time, but it seemed like in 1917 and 1916, they seem to still be toying a little bit, even in the GPO, with some debates that maybe they could get a German princeling in. And there's evidence, there's some kind of random conversations about things like that, that actually what they want is separation from Britain. And they're not quite sure what form an independent Irish state will take. Now, by 1918, the world has changed. There has been a slew of Republican revolutions all across Europe. There's been the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And suddenly a republic looks much more viable. It's not an IRB sort of fantasy thing going back to the 18th century anymore. It's really real. People are putting out republics left, right, and centre. And so I think by that point, there is a shift. And certainly figures like De Valera really do believe in a republic. Now, how they see the relationship between, say, a church and a republic, that seems to be kind of ad hoc, something they develop as they go along. And they certainly don't see it as a French republic with separation of church and state in the same way that, you know, maybe the later definitions of a republic would become. So I think there's a question mark over how many of them become Republican and when. But for me, that December election after World War I, when most of Central and Eastern Europe has turned into a republic and people can see what that looks like and want to be part of that same kind of moment and that same, if you like, great game of forming republics at a diplomatic level, that's when you start to see change. Their other big model is America. And obviously America remains in this period a deeply religious society, but also a republic. And so I think that's one of the models they're looking to as well. But there's a question mark. Some of those people were probably still closet home rulers for a lot longer than we perhaps really recognise. You know, there is definitely still a question mark when exactly the change happens. Good question. Thank you. Yeah,
I'm just conscious, 100 years later, seismic events, particularly in Northern Ireland, living in England, people barely register. At this time, were people, you know, on the mainland or whatever they call it in those days, in England, I mean, were they registering this? Were MPs at risk of losing their seats? You know, was it making headlines that people were following?
So it's really interesting. In 1921, it's hugely live. But by the end of the Irish Civil War, it has completely disappeared. So once Bonar Law actually comes in at the end of 22, you see a really big shift. Everyone thinks this first vote on the Anglo-Irish Treaty has solved the problem, and the Tory diehards have been sold 2 votes. they thought if it wasn't working out, they could reject the Free State Constitution. And Michael Collins is also thinking in this line, because he then develops a constitution in 1922 that is basically a republic in all but name, and the British say, well, we can't accept that, and they send it back to him, and he has to develop another one, and that delays the whole process. So by the time they have the second vote, they have very little time. They have to pass it, or the whole recognition of the Free State will collapse because it has to be approved by a certain deadline. And so that second parliamentary vote is rushed through, and there's very little interest in the British public about that. It's not an election issue that year. So it seems like people get this idea that once the War of Independence is solved with the truce and the Anglo-Irish Treaty, it's done, it's finished, and the British public switches off. The one thing they tune back into is the death of Collins, who'd somehow taken on this kind of, Smuts-like figure who's come over to our side kind of image, gunman turned good, glamorous figure at the treaty talks, man of mystery. His death gets a lot of press coverage, but they are really turning away. It's not a political issue in the Civil War. And that also makes it very hard then for figures in Parliament who are saying, no, we need to keep an interest in Ireland, we need to look out for Southern Unionists, we need to be aware of what's going on there. That is just, it's not receiving any pickup in the British public or the press, actually, by 23 particularly. So yeah, there's this moment in 21 where actually the public, like for the War of Independence, they do care. This is a big issue. They're very concerned about the damage being done to Britain's international image. Dual propaganda is extremely effective abroad. And this is really damaging. They've gone to war for small nations, save Belgium, international values of liberalism, democracy. And here they're being seen as like burning Balbriggan, burning Cork. This is not the image the British public wants of their country.
One more question.
Just thanks, Heather. Just an observation about yes, and one that I think we've shared before, just about the jaggedness of the edges and whatever, and doubleness, whatever you want to call it. Doubleness is too negative a word, but contrasts even within families. And so, just as a lighter thing, and I'm sure this story could be repeated many times over, but in my own kind of Collinsite 1918 Sinn Féin mother's family in Rosscarbery. My aunts, I remember when my grand-aunts were doing this, that they got a big shock when they were sent down to visit their Auntie Bridgie in West Cork, where my grandfather had come from. He trained as a teacher and gotten a job in West Cork, and he had become a Republican through the Gaelic League, etc., the classic way. And they went down to Auntie Bridgie, who apparently was a terrible boss as well. They were confronted by a picture of the King and Queen inside their house.
Yeah.
Whereas they grew up in a house where they revered Collins. Yeah. And apparently she was not too pleased with her brother's activities during this time. So it just goes to show that there are jagged edges. And also there's that whole thing, as we've talked about before, of, we don't like the monarchy, but you look at the town ratings for a royal wedding or something like that.
But the thing that's interesting as well about all of that is, this is a war of symbols, right? So people in England in this period had the King and Queen in their house. They would have the framed kind of like papal pictures as well in the Irish tradition. Like there are pictures of these kinds of figures around your house. You show your allegiance. They're on the wall of schools. They're on the walls of universities, hospitals. King and Queen, the image of them when you go in. So it's a really visual culture of monarchism. And that's part of this, that has to be dismantled in Ireland. But on the other hand, they don't want to dismantle it too much for everybody, because one of the things in the Anglo-Irish settlement is to allow Southern Unionists to transition. So political union is dead as a doornail in the south of Ireland after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But Southern Unionists can still retain the cultural monarchism bit of it. So that's not cut off. And that's how they transition.
And they get to keep the state prayers until 1949.
Exactly, and that you can still appeal to the Privy Council until quite late. So the whole stepping stone process then kicks in, by which the trappings of monarchy are dismantled step by step across the following 20 years. And you find Southern Unionist sources for this period on the treaty saying, well, at least we get to keep the king, so it's not actually that bad, it'll be okay. And that, because the monarchism, as I showed with Bernard's sermon, really mattered to them. And it was almost, as I would say, as important as the political act of union. So once that was kept, that again allowed Ireland to get through this period without perhaps the mass purges or some of the even more extreme kinds of violence that occur on the continent. So it's interesting that this compromise had those spaces for people to take their time and for it to pass another generation before everybody became kind of maybe more Republican or whatever it might be.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you.